All right, if we're all set, we're going to get started with our class on the Franciscan history. This is our third class. We're now covering the Generalate of Saint Bonaventure and its consequences. And so these are the years 1257 to 1274. My hope is to get us perhaps even past the Generalate of Bonaventure and to do a little overview before we get to I think it's called the spiritual crisis, would be the next section. I'm not too sure we'll get to that, but let's see how far we can get with our class today. So, Saint Bonaventure of Bagnoregio, Saint Bonaventure of Bagnoregio, or as he's also known as John of Fidenza, right? So he made his novitiate in the year 1243. So he made his novitiate in the year 1243. That's when he joined the order. He was 36 years old when he became the Minister General of the order. Think about that. He was only 36 years old when he became Minister General. I remember how he became Minister General. John of Parma was being forced out of office by the coup that went to the Pope, and the Pope then forced John of Parma to resign in all kinds of tactics. And so the rest of the brothers would not accept John's resignation. And so they asked him to point to somebody. So he pointed to Bonaventure, and then Bonaventure was elected Minister General. So he was conservative by nature. He didn't make any innovations with the order. On April 23rd, 1257, 3 months after his election, he sent a circular letter to the friars, and he outlined his plans for government. And basically, he was going to defend the order from the external enemies. When we talked about the external enemies with the secular clergy and the problems that were being created by the privileges and exemptions that were causing the struggle with the diocesan clergy and the friars. And then we had that William St. Amour guy who was fighting hard to get rid of the mendicants. And we haven't seen the last of William St. Amour either. And then he also wanted, in his letter, he wanted to maintain the positions that the order had already gained. So he wasn't going to go backwards and go back to the original primitive observance. He was going to keep things as they were. This is where we're at. This is where we're moving forward from. And then he wanted to establish a uniform observance of the life. So he's going to try to bring it to a uniform, so you have all these different ways of living the life that are out there. These guys living that over here, these guys living like that over there. He's going to bring uniformity to the order, okay? And so from exiles, William St. Amour again began to excite the enemies of the order. He now argued that the Friars Minor did not have a right to exist at all. Like he was continuing this whole mission to attack the order. He questioned, was gospel poverty of the friars in contradiction to the gospel? So was gospel poverty, the way Franciscans were living it, was it contrary to the gospel? If this were true, then the order would have to be suppressed. This sounds so weird. This guy who was, banished from France, who lost a debate against the greatest minds of history, he's still swinging. And yet he was influencing a lot of people, and so it became a real threat. Saint Bonaventure, as Minister General, defended the ecclesiastical ownership of property. He defended poverty as the foundation of evangelical perfection, once again. And he took up the same arguments of those used when he was the teacher at the University of Paris. Okay, so Bonaventure did, in fact, complete that first mission of defending the order from the outside attacks. Regarding Bonaventure and the privileges that the friars had gained, he tried to correct the abuses that came from these privileges. So he interpreted the rule more broadly than Francis's contemporaries. And he felt that he needed to take into consideration the way the order had developed. It's we're talking 1257, so we're talking 31 years after the death of St. Francis. So it's kind of like, guys, this is where we've come to. We got to take to what it's developed into, and let's take it from here. And he denied that the entire order was guilty of abuses. He did see the fact that there were abuses, but he didn't say the whole order was guilty of abuses. And that was a fact. I mean, you see how the order was growing in so many different places, the observance of the rule and the saints it was producing during this time period. It certainly was not fully corrupt. It was just struggling as it was trying to figure out how to now implement the ideals of St. Francis. Now that Francis was gone, it wasn't there to give them that correction or direction. So Bonaventure did not accept all the customs introduced at the beginning of the order, neither did he reject them. So he didn't accept them nor reject all the customs introduced at the beginning. He also did not interpret the rule according to the Testament, but he interpreted the rule according to papal decrees. So he wasn't on that side of the spirituals where he was only going to use the Testament and Quo Elongati to interpret. He was going to use all of the papal bulls that were given. But above all, he did follow Quo Elongati, above all. So he did build large friaries inside city walls. And this wasn't against the rule, but it was not what Francis himself desired. I mean, Francis never established friaries inside the walls of a city. You have to remember that when the cities in Europe, you had the wall, and everyone lived inside the wall, unless you're poor, you lived outside the wall, because now you were defenseless if someone should attack, right? Inside the city was protected, and outside was not. Only the poor, the most poor, lived outside the city walls. And so the Franciscans always lived outside the city walls, not inside the city. They'd walk in to do their preaching, their begging, and so forth, and they'd back out to the fields. Okay, but also protected the contemplative aspect of the life. So Francis never set down a rule saying you can't have friaries inside the city, but he never established any friaries inside the city. They were always outside the city. And Bonaventure began to build large friaries inside the cities. And for Bonaventure, he saw studies as the main work of the friars. He lived at the University of Paris so long as studies did not take him away. He promoted studies. He divided students from 32 provinces into 4 groups: the Spaniards, the Germans, the Lombards, and the Romans. That was to help them learn. So he had these 4 groups that the friars would live in those groups so that they could learn and help each other in study. He procured inheritances to the University of Paris for the friars' tuition. So he set up that so the friars can actually go to school and have their tuition paid. And then the general chapters, he instituted intellectual competitions. So you'd have these debates that would go on at some of the general chapters for the brothers who would engage in the studies to have kind of a nice little forum for some sparring. Okay? He held that the rule did not forbid the learned to study, and those not able to read were not allowed to study. So he kind of followed Francis's admonition that the friars who don't know how to read shouldn't be anxious to learn. So he was kind of following that. He also held the lay brothers could study if they were ordered to do so by the superior. If they were ordered to do so by the superior. Okay? And according to the Minister General Bonaventure, study was to lead to mystical contemplation. Now, this is really important when you have to understand Bonaventure. For Bonaventure, studying theology was not just about theology. Being in the true Franciscan school of theology, founded by Anthony of Padua, when St. Francis wrote that letter to St. Anthony of Padua and said, I give you permission to teach theology so long as you do not extinguish the spirit of prayer and devotion. So Bonaventure, rightly, being formed in that Franciscan school, understood that theology, the study of theology, was to lead us to contemplation of God, which is why the Franciscan instruction in studying your theology is you should be praying your theology on your knees before the tabernacle. As Franciscans, we just don't study our theology, we pray our theology because the goal of it is to lead us to contemplation. It doesn't extinguish the spirit of prayer, but should be enlivening the spirit of prayer within us. So that's really important when you look at the Franciscan versus the Dominican model of study. Not that Dominicans don't believe that your theology leads you to prayer, but you should not be excused from prayer to study, which is part of the Dominican life. For the Franciscans, one is not excused from prayer so one can study your theology. One is to go to prayer and employ the theology in prayer and coming to know the God whom we love, and to love the God we know. Okay? So St. Bonaventure took a stand towards this Joachimism. Remember Joachimism? We mentioned it already, but that monk who, Joachim of Fiore, who talked about the 3 ages, the age of the Father, the age of the Son, the age of the Holy Spirit, and that there was going to come the prophet who would be marked, who would bring the everlasting gospel and begin the age of the Holy Spirit, where there be no longer need for sacraments and so forth. Now the theology was condemned, and St. Bonaventure did in fact have to hold his own professor, his former Minister General, John of Palmer, on trial for being a Joachimist. Did find him innocent. But Bonaventure had a little attitude or disposition towards it. There were 3 friars who were Joachimists, who really did buy it, and he imprisoned them. And as I mentioned, he put John of Parma on trial. And John was tried for predicting a split in the order and holding Joachimist theories. And again, he was acquitted of all charges. But Joachimism did speak about the seraph and so forth. Many things in Joachim's writings, the Franciscans began to look towards St. Francis as fulfilling perhaps some of the things that Joachim spoke about. And we're going to get back to that a little bit later, because Joachimism begins to play a new role in, or gets seen in a new light as time goes on. It's a real plague on the order in those first years after Francis' death, those first 50 years after his death, maybe a little bit beyond that. So the apostolate, according to Saint Bonaventure, he held that there were 9 qualities required of a preacher. So anybody who wants to become a Franciscan preacher, these are 9 qualities every preacher is supposed to have. 1, he's about 30 years old. I think he bases that on the life of Christ, right? So he said a preacher should be about 30 years old. And this isn't just a preacher, meaning someone who preaches on punishment and glory, vice and virtue. Those are exhortations that any of the brothers were permitted to preach on. This is dogmatic preaching, moral theology preaching, preaching on the sacraments. So one needs to be about 30 years old. Here's a funny one. He must have a manly face or character. A manly face or character. Not being boyish, I guess. He had to have a commanding appearance. A commanding appearance. So these little weak Franciscan preachers are not exactly what Bonaventure thought of when he thought about the Franciscan preacher. The Franciscan preacher must have a commanding appearance. Good health. You have to have good health. An ease of elocution. An ease of elocution. To be a very good speaker. Easy to speak well. He had to have had good knowledge of grammar and theology. I probably got the theology part down, but the grammar, I probably wouldn't have passed Bonaventure's grammar test. Edifying conduct. Edifying conduct. You need to be industrious and well-educated. Industrious and well-educated. When it says industrious, I think maybe someone creative in their approach to presenting theology as a preacher. And then finally, had to dedicate himself to ministry more out of obedience than out of his own will. Out of obedience rather than out of one's own will. So the whole thing of being sent through the gift of obedience rather than going on one's own without being sent. The whole concept of the mandatum, of being sent with that obedience, and then the graces would flow more regularly from the one who is obedient. Now, as the confessor, he gave a couple of qualities for a confessor. He said he must be discreet and trustworthy. The confessor had the privilege of being a confessor can only be granted at provincial chapters. Only when the local province got together, and then the provincial can assign the confessor. And the confessor had to ask permission from the local bishop and parish priest, and the friar priest could only ask for it with the consent of his own provincial custodian. Now, this was done to ease the tensions between the diocesan clergy and the friars. So Bonaventure said the friar confessor had to have the permission of first, his own superior to hear confessions. Secondly, of the local bishop. Third, you need the permission of the parish priest. Now, by putting that restriction on the friars, it eased that tension with the diocesan clergy. The friars weren't just kind of getting in on their business in that sense, or doing their ministry, what was truly theirs to do as the shepherds of their flock. So he pulled the friars back so they could be the men in the other boat. So when asked, then they can go help. Okay. Now, Pope Alexander IV granted Bonaventure full authority over the friars. So no privileges could be invoked without Bonaventure's approval. And no one could receive a prelature without his permission. He was invested with all powers of apostolic penitentiaries in favor of the friars. Now, in one sense, these are a lot of privileges being given to Bonaventure, but what it does is it allows him to actually minister as the minister general of the order. It gives him the ability to kind of get a hold of the community, which seems to be flaying out of control, and he pulling it together. So the Holy Father really entrusted him with what was necessary for Bonaventure to pull the order together and create the unity out of the disunity that's been happening since the beginning. Now, as regards to regular observance, In his two circular letters, Bonaventure addressed certain things. He addressed idleness. He addressed this too many frequent outings without reason. One needs a reason to be going out of the friary. A too close relationship with the laity. He found this problematic, that we need to have a separation from the laity, not because they're bad or dirty or evil or going to ruin us, but no, there's that sense of separation, the way St. Francis wanted us to live. Fourth, inconsiderate nominations to different offices. Not really better consideration of who gets appointed to what office within the order. There need to be more clarity to that, more thinking involved in, I should say. The superfluous reception of money. There was no need to be collecting all this money. So Bonaventure was very committed to poverty. Irksome requests. That bugged him no bit. Irksome requests. Okay, stop requesting all these irksome things, right? He complained about buildings being too rich. They need to be more poor. So although Bonaventure was building big friaries in cities, he was also trying to be very fervent about being poor in the way things were built. To avoid search for inheritances or legacies. So he didn't like guys going out there and catching an old lady on a deathbed or some noble lord on his deathbed, and so the guy can give the friar leave the friary all their stuff, So he put the kibosh on that. Too frequent changes of friaries. He didn't like this whole thing of close this friary, open this friary, close this friary, open that friary. No. He wanted a little bit of stability. He was trying to pull things to some stability there. Too easy and too large expenditures. So he didn't like all these expenditures of things, that there was too much and it was too big the things. And he was able to clamp down on it and create a better sense of poverty. So Bonaventure had a really good sense of poverty where things were being begged that were rich, that were, that were a lot of them, and that were more for, convenience. Bonaventure clamped down on that with the few poor and necessary. So he was good about trying to get the friars to once again go back to that ideal given to us by our seraphic father, St. Francis. So Bonaventure turned to prayer as his first means of correcting the friars. He prayed for them, did penance for them, and obtained graces for them to find that peace so they could be observant to the life. Now, poverty was very dear to the heart of Saint Bonaventure. He insisted on the principles of total renunciation of property and the absolute ownership of the Holy See. So he's very strong on that. He also approved of new methods in order to persevere, to preserve the ideal. For example, the procurators, okay? And he said the nuncio, the procurator, was not the representative of the one who receives, but of the one who gives. Why is this important? So the procurator, the nuncio, the person who has received these things that people want to give to the friars, this person's coordinating and organizing all of that he doesn't work for the friars. He works for the lay people who are giving it. So it's not for the friars to be in charge of this guy. It is for the lay people to talk with themselves about how they're going to do it. It's not for the friars to do. So he made that strong distinction that the nuncio or the procurator is not the representative of the one who receives, meaning the friars, but the one who gives, meaning the laity. He's in charge of their stuff, not the friars' stuff. Whatever they gave him for the friars doesn't belong to the friars. It belongs to those people to figure out what they're going to do with it. Okay? So that was a good move on his part. He refused to accept revenues directly, but he did defend the acceptance of what was given through a benefactor. Okay? He placed 3 conditions on the use of money: small in quantity, cheap, and for the use of the community. Small in quantity, cheap, and for the use of the community. So what was necessary? Now, he did hold that everything had to be in the strictest poverty. But the reception of money itself was contrary to the rule of Francis that told the friars 3 times in the rule not to use money. Now, it's even like the bookends of the rule, but or to receive money. However, Bonaventure, kind of playing both sides here, thought that he absolutely had to have money for whatever purpose. He prohibited the use of the papal bull Ordinum Vestrum, which we discussed, and I think it was our first or second class, Ordinum Vestrum. We discussed that particular papal bull that so he pushed it aside. During the General Chapter of 1269, Bonaventure advised visitators to denounce those provinces where glaring abuses reigned. So during a General Chapter, Bonaventure advised the visitators to go back to their provinces and to denounce those provinces where glaring abuses reigned. The stocking up of wheat was one of the abuses. Sumptuous buildings was an abuse. Affection in clothes and food was an abuse. Curiosity in paintings was an abuse. I guess guys like walking around museums or something. Traveling by horseback was considered an abuse. And then unnecessary trips was considered an abuse. Okay? So these were the 6 abuses that he comes up with that the friars had to be attentive to when they went back, the visitators, to basically tell the brothers that this stuff had to stop. Okay? Now, in regards to living in the city, Bonaventure had reasons for it. These were the reasons, the 3 reasons he gave why the friaries needed to be in the cities. Okay? First, so as to be more promptly at the disposition of those who have recourse to our ministry. So to be more prompt about ministry, they're right there. They don't have to go a mile outside the city to get the friars. Secondly, so as to find more easily our sustenance. It was easier to beg when you're living inside the city and you're close, instead of having to walk a mile with a bag over your shoulder to get the food you needed to bring it back out. Third, so as to safeguard against bandits and thieves. To safeguard against bandits and thieves. So again, you're in the city, you're protected. Now, I particularly would take issue with that with Bonaventure, have that discussion with him, because I stand far more in the Capuchin tradition of 1 mile outside the city, modeling on the Portiuncula. But, however, he is a saint. I'm not. He's a doctor of the church. I'm not. However, I am a friar. He's a friar. And I think we can have a good friar discussion about this. I guess that would be a friar side of this. I forget it. Anyway, so regarding the liturgy, Bonaventure and the liturgy. For the most part, the liturgy was set before he became Minister General by Hebon of Faversham of John and Parma. Okay? So the ordinances of the 1257 chapter had already been introduced, and they'd been prepared by the former Minister General John of Parma. So we talked about this, the extraordinary form of, as we know it as the extraordinary form of the Mass, the breviary was set, and so forth. Bonaventure recalled to the friars that preaching and ministry were not reasons to be dispensed from the divine office. Preaching and ministry were not reasons to be dispensed from the divine office. The preaching and ministry was to be done in between the divine office, not during. Nor did he want the divine office shortened for the sake of ministry. He did not want it shortened for the sake of ministry. It's interesting, in today's day and age, we have the Second Vatican Council, it took from 8 hours of the divine office, it suppressed prime, and then it gave diocesan priests the option of praying one of the 3 smaller offices, either terce, sexta, or none, right? And even if you read the breviary today, it's not set up to pray all 7 hours. You got to figure out how to do it. However, in the instructions on the Roman Missal, it says those communities that have the custom of praying all 7 hours in common, it is to be retained. It is to be retained. As Franciscans, we always prayed all 7 hours of the office in divine office in common. And so according to the directives of the Second Vatican Council, it should be retained. And ministry, according to Bonaventure, the apostolate, is not an excuse. It's not an excuse. Well, I can't do the small hours because it interferes with the ministry. No, it doesn't. It shouldn't. If it does, the ministry is not being done properly, according to Bonaventure and according to the Second Vatican Council. It said that the divine office must be celebrated with dignity, ardor, and devotion. Bonaventure wanted the divine office celebrated with dignity, ardor, and devotion. In most Franciscan friars today, you can barely get the office prayed more than morning and evening prayer, sometimes night prayer. Most friaries today. And we have to ask, is there dignity, ardor, and devotion? I can tell you when I was a postulant, living in New York City, we were done in the office in 4.5 minutes flat, and that was including the song. There wasn't much dignity, ardor, or devotion. The only ardor was the fire put underneath to get it done quick. Anyway, it was contrary to what Bonaventure is saying how we should celebrate the office. In 1260, Bonaventure introduced a few feasts onto the calendar of the church. And he had a lot of influence with the Holy Father, and particularly with the liturgy, in introducing feasts. Here are some of them. Listen to this. It was Bonaventure introduced the Feast of the Most Holy Trinity. Bonaventure introduced the Feast of the Most Holy Trinity. He also added the Feast of the Doctors, Augustine, Gregory, Jerome, and Ambrose. Of course, after the death of St. Clare, she was canonized in 11 months, so he introduced the celebration of the Feast of St. Clare. And then, in the Confiteor, when we say that prayer, we strike our breast 3 times, in the Old Mass particularly, there was a particular form to it. You called on Peter and Paul. Well, St. Bonaventure had St. Francis' name inserted into the Confiteor, so and I call, St. Michael, St. Peter, St. Paul, St. Francis, you'd ask him to intercede for us. The antiphon of the Blessed Virgin Mary was added after Compline. So how after Compline we used to sing the Salve Regina, the Sup or some hymn to Our Lady. That was Bonaventure's influence on the liturgy. Nearly all general chapters that were held during the Generalate of Bonaventure were concerned with the liturgy. He was very much a liturgist. And then 1269, 9 years after those other feasts, he added some more on. For example, the Feast of the Immaculate Conception, the Feast of the Visitation of Our Lady, the Feast of St. Anne. And it was St. Bonaventure's great work that had each Saturday set aside as Our Lady's Day. He's the one who introduced Saturdays as the Blessed Mother's Day. Why? Because when everyone else was weeping and crying on Saturday over the Lord's death, when he lied in the tomb, Our Lady was preparing for the resurrection. She lived that day in hope. And so now every Saturday is given to Our Lady, and each Saturday we're to live in hope for the Sunday, the day of the resurrection. Then the friars were invited to preach that 3 Hail Marys should be prayed when the laity hear the friary bell ring after Compline. So beginning with Bonaventure, we have now the ringing of the bells for the Angelus. So these are some of the beautiful gifts that not only St. Francis gave, but the sons of St. Francis poured out upon the church. These beautiful liturgical celebrations. Now, regarding the unity of the order, St. Bonaventure placed under pain of excommunication, forbade anyone to work under any pretense whatsoever in dividing the order. So he was going to try to bring unity. So if you tried to divide the order, you are now going to be under pain of excommunication. I remember he got that privilege from the Pope Alexander IV. Albeit a good idea, the division was inevitable later on because of these 2 camps that never really surrendered. Bonaventure kind of placated both of them, like he lived in the Hermitage friaries, but built the big friaries. So he was placating both sides. And so, although he kept the peace, the time was coming when it was going to erupt after him. So in 1260, we have the Constitutions of Narbonne. The Constitutions of Narbonne. Now, remember that after Francis wrote the rule, there was traditions that were there were customs and so forth, disciplinary stuff of how to handle this or that situation. And so there needed to be some sort of codified list of somehow to deal with these various things, putting it all together. So the General Chapter of 1260 asked St. Bonaventure, to write the Constitutions. And so Bonaventure put together the Constitutions, and in 1260, the General Chapter of Narbonne, that's the name of the town, Narbonne, Narbonne. Narbonne, Narbonne. So it's more of a redaction of the 1239 Constitutions and additions of rules that developed over the past 21 years. Okay? There are no innovations to the Constitutions of 1239, only a penal code. Penance to be imposed on the most important offenses. Now, before I get into the Constitution of Narbonne and talk about these 12 chapters of it, I want to state something very clear. This was not a replacement for the rule. Constitutions are not a replacement for the rule. The rule of St. Francis is the rule of St. Francis. Constitutions were written in order to protect the rule. So you write a constitution to protect the rule, to allow the rule to be lived, not to mitigate the rule. Too oftentimes today, constitutions are being written as the document that's to be followed, and even where it contradicts the rule. So oftentimes constitutions today are being written that mitigate the rule, and so it's a constitution of mitigation of the rule, as opposed to constitutions that are written to protect the rule. In Bonaventure's constitutions, we see that it's written to protect the rule, or to simply give us guides to be able to live the rule, to deal with certain disciplines of things. Okay, very important point here. And each of the 12 chapters follow one of the chapters of the Rule of Francis. Okay? And we do have these constitutions. They still exist. The Constitutions of Narbonne. They're in one of the, if you get the books published by Franciscan Institute Press, or Franciscan Publications, something like that, the name of the company. They have a book of the writings of, early writings of the order, Bonaventure's early writings of the order, concerning the order. So the 12 chapters concern the admissions of novices to profession, the quality, dimension, and color of the habit, the practice of poverty, fasting and abstinence, leaving the friary or the province, occupations such as manual work, intellectual work, preaching, confessions, penal laws, visitation of provinces, the election of the provincial minister general, the nominations of custodians and guardians, the provincial chapter, the general chapter, suffrages accorded to the deceased friars. So these are all things that basically were more customs to how we live the life, as opposed to rules that would mitigate the rule of St. Francis, or precepts that mitigate the rule of Francis. These were precepts that were given to us, codified, what we call the constitutions, in order to basically more flesh out how we live the life. Okay? And then monthly, these constitutions were to be read in the friary. And even though they didn't really change anything, they did add some stuff. Bonaventure declared that statutes of preceding ministers abolished and ordered all other copies to be destroyed. So our good obedient friars did not destroy them, thanks be to God, because now we have the records. So the Church Council of Lyon, the 14th Ecumenical Council, it opened on May 7th, 1274. May 12th, 1274. The Church Council of Lyons, Lyons, not Lio, Lyons, the 14th Ecumenical Council. It was up to Saint Bonaventure, now a cardinal, to make the preparations for this council. He took an active part in the council and assisted in the reuniting of the Eastern and Western Church at the council. All the representatives from the Orthodox Church were there, and Bonaventure successfully was able to get everyone to agree to reunite the East and the West. St. Pope John Paul II would say the two lungs breathing together again. Unfortunately, Bonaventure died at the end of the council on July 15th, 1274. July 15th, 1274. Bonaventure dies. Interesting, Thomas Aquinas was supposed to be at the council, and he died along the way. Could you imagine what it must have been like if you had both St. Bonaventure and St. Thomas Aquinas present at the Council of Lyons, reuniting the church together? Would have been amazing. Unfortunately, when all of the delegates from the Eastern Church returned home, the offer was rejected. So unfortunately, it didn't unite the order, but Bonaventure died believing that he had actually reunited the church. How sad that he found out in heaven that didn't happen, right? Now, Pope Gregory X was Pope at the time for the Council of Lyons, and he had a great love for Bonaventure, a great trust in Bonaventure. And so when Bonaventure died at the end of the council, he ordered that every single priest of the church offer a mass for Bonaventure. And it was tough, I guess, losing Bonaventure. The Pope was so close to him. Now, at the council, the mendicants were terribly attacked. The council fathers didn't realize that the mendicants had a majority of votes at the council. A lot of friars, both the Dominicans and Franciscans, had become bishops at this point, and they had the majority. So this ruined all the plans that were made at the council by the enemies of the friars to suppress the Order of Friars Minor, the Augustinians, the Dominicans, the Carmelites, and all other Mendicant orders. Right? They wanted to suppress them all. Now, there was a battle. There was, I guess, a discussion. I don't know how intense it was. I call it a fight, but I presume Bonaventure was up there swinging, trying to fight during the council for the order. And in the end, at the end of the council, the only ones who survived were the Franciscans, the Augustinians, the Dominicans, and the Carmelites. Any other Mendicant order that was out there at the time was suppressed. So a furious propaganda was begun by the Zelanti, who were eventually restricted to hermitages. Once Bonaventure died, the Zelanti just began to grow again. Bonaventure kept the peace between the Zelanti, the Zealots, or the spirituals, as we're now calling them, and the community, or the conventuals, as we're now calling them. So the dispute was starting to rise again once Bonaventure died. It was picking up again. As much as Bonaventure tried to keep the peace by placating both sides, he wasn't able to do it. And so once Bonaventure died, that was it. It just erupted all over again. You have particularly three people, we should say, two people to look at who are part of the Zelanti, or the spirituals. Peter of Marcerata, Marcerata, Peter of Marcerata. And then Peter da Fossombrone, Peter of Fossombrone, Fossombrone, Fossombrone. And now he eventually took the name Angelo Clareno, Clareno, Clareno. So he took that name. So we'll see those characters again later on. So, that kind of covers Bonaventure's pontificate, his generalate of the order, and how he kind of managed everything. I mean, there's so much more to Bonaventure's life. We're just getting a little snippet of it. We spent 35 minutes discussing his generalate, but there's so much more to him as a person, so much more to his work, his ministry, his friendship with Thomas Aquinas, the very fact that he was doing, quantum physics, at a time 800 years before quantum physics was discovered. It's been discovered recently that Bonaventure was doing quantum physics, nothing new there. So anyway, there's so much more to him, but that kind of gives us a cover or a brief overview of Bonaventure's generalate and its effect upon the order. So let's go a little brief overview up until 1279, okay? 1260, we have the General Chapter Narbonne. The constitutions of Narbonne are approved. Bonaventure rejects the papal bull Ordinum Vestrum. The chapter commissions Bonaventure to write the life of St. Francis. We saw that when we did the class on Franciscan sources. 1263, the Legenda Majore of Bonaventure is approved, considered the sole interpretation of Francis's life. The General Chapter is held 1266, which requires that all previous accounts written by about St. Francis are burned, including both of Chilano's and so forth, which the friars don't do, thanks be to God. And again, it was done as a way of trying to unify the order, which did away with all those dividing memories of the old days. The old days are gone. We won't talk about the old days. On May 19th, 1274, the General Chapter, where Bonaventure is still alive. And so in 1274, after so many years as general, Jerome of Ascoli is elected Minister General. Jerome of Ascoli. 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 1274 to 1279. So he's going to be Minister General for 5 years. Jerome of Ascoli. 1274 to 1279. So he eventually became a cardinal. And he was an absentee general, always doing work for Rome. So he really wasn't around too much, Jerome of Ascoli. In 1279, there was a General Chapter, and Bonagrazia di San Giovanni in Persiceto is elected Minister General. There's a long name for you. Bonagrazia. Bonagrazia, Bonagrazia of, or di, San Giovanni in Persiceto. I can't say that right. Persiceto. I just call him Bonagrazia, right? Good enough. He's Minister General from 1279 to 1283. Okay? So Bona Grazia first went to Pope Nicholas III, who was Pope from 1277 to 1280, to ask for a cardinal protector. So Pope Nicholas III had been the cardinal protector since 1261. So Bona Grazia also asked Pope Nicholas III for a solemn definition of the rule, one that would dispel all doubts against critics. Nicholas III assembled a council to give an answer. After 2 months of work, he published the papal bull Exit, E-X-I-I-T, Exit. So I just gave you a quick snippet of what happens after Bonaventure dies. We have the election of Jerome Ascoli in 1274. Again, Bonaventure's alive, but then Bonaventure dies. But 1274, Jerome Ascoli is elected, okay? And he becomes a cardinal, so he's really around. So that same year is when they have another election, and they elect Bona Grazia as the Minister General. And obviously there's tension in the order if he's now going to kind of get this cardinal protector for the order. So there's got to be tension going on. Bonaventure's dead, and things are kind of getting out of control again. The peacemaker is gone. The guy who was holding all things together is no longer there, so he's going to pull things back together. And so he goes to Nicholas III, wants a cardinal protector, and he wants a definition of the rule. Covi Longati just somehow for the friars isn't cutting it, and now they're going to get another one. It's called Exit. So the papal bull, and we'll try to finish with this, the papal bull Exit qui seminat. Exit qui seminat. E-X-I-I-T, exit qui, Q-U-I, seminat. S-E-M-I-N-A-T. Exit qui seminat. By Pope Nicholas III, August 14th, 1279. August 14th, 1279. So Pope Nicholas III proposed the following: to put an end to the calamities and criticisms from the adversaries of the order who continued to discredit the rule, to resolve the new difficulties that were arising from its practice. In it, he praised the friars and exhorted their way of life. It resolved 2 questions. The friars given to divine services, study, or to ministry of souls were not bound to manual labor. Not so good, right? But okay. Second, the words, let the friars not preach in any diocese of a bishop if he has forbidden them, must be observed to the letter without prejudice to the Pope. So this was words from St. Francis in the rule that Pope Nicholas III is saying must be observed to the letter without prejudice to the Pope giving it permission. It deviated very little from Covi Longati. It supported Covi Longati in many ways. But a distinction was made between usage de jure and an ownership. The ownership de jure and usage de facto. It said only necessary things were permitted for the friars' livelihood. Praise God, only necessary things. It permitted things for friars to accomplish their work: food, clothing, things for divine worship, things for study. But things had to be poor and for poor usage. So Nicholas III is getting it here. Maybe he was influenced by Bonaventure when he was a cardinal, I don't know. But he is saying that in order to live the rule, one has to have things that are poor and have a poor use of them. Okay? He said the friars could have recourse to spiritual friends for clothing, friary construction, and books necessary for studies. Those are the 3 areas he gave the friars that they can have recourse to. Of course, health needs, but he said illicit legacies or inheritances made for the friars had to be refused. Friars could receive the alms that were given for the use of the land, for example, trees, etc., from which the friary sat, even though the land belonged to another owner. So they could use the fruit even though the land belonged to somebody else. Okay? The procurators of the nuncio were reintroduced for sales and money transactions. It did not answer the question as to who can appoint them, so it just kind of passed on. The testament was not obligatory, which again, inside of the spirituals, the Isolanti, and then said no one, under the pain of excommunication, could speak against the rule or the friars. So again, William say no more, if you're still alive at this time, again, to speak against the rule of the friars, will be excommunicated. Nicholas III, a little bit of a protector of the order, you think? Just a little bit. So this papal bull put an end to the 40-year battle with the secular priests. But however, the spirituals were not happy with this bull. Now again, you have to understand what's going on at the time. Bonaventure did his best keeping everybody at peace. He was living in the poor friaries, promulgating the poor use of things and so forth, but building large friaries. Everyone was happy under Bonaventure, so there wasn't this upheaval. But once he was gone, the fights began again. The community, now being known as the conventuals, are just going right back to the old habits of exemptions and privileges, that they were not using under Bonaventure. And then the friars, who were trying to be faithful to the rule, the zealots, the spirituals, were continuing to influence other friars to say, hey, we need to go back to the way Francis intended it. We need to live the life that Francis gave us. And so the tension is building, and it's growing. And it's going to hit a climax where it's going to be an explosion between the two communities, and something's got to give. You can't have these two coexisting observances under the one leadership. Bonaventure kept the peace only because it was Bonaventure. It was coming to a point where it was going to have to now come to a head. And so in upcoming classes, we're going to talk about the spiritual quarrel. We'll talk about the development of the spirituals, people who were the spirituals. We'll talk about Joachimism. And we're going to go from 1274 to 318. So we're going to cover a good 30, 40, 50 years there almost. I'm going to go through and see what exactly happened and took place with these spirituals and the conventuals, and come to find out what exactly happened. So hang on for the next class. And then we'll start moving into the next part, which will discuss the observant reform. So next time around we'll cover the spirituals and the quarrel with the spirituals and the community. But I want you to keep in mind that too often times the spirituals are villainized. The zealots are villainized, even using the word zealot, giving them this nickname that they're villainized. They're villains of the order. They're not. I encourage you to kind of consider them as perhaps the friars who were trying to be most faithful, who perhaps were in fact angered, struggling with the fact that they were being forced to compromise their conscience and what they vowed to live. They vowed to live the rule as Francis wrote it. They entered because they wanted the Franciscan charism as Francis gave it to them. And they felt that the mitigations and all of these other things were being introduced, these privileges and so forth, were taking them away from that which was given to them. And they were trying to hold on to and not lose what was handed on to them from Christ through Francis. So as we get close to talk about the spirituals, please do not think about them as these mere villains or angry guys trying to get at the community who just wanted their way. If anything, they were the ones being suppressed and pushed down by those who wanted a more comfortable life, those who wanted a more of a relaxed life, those who wanted to be more with it, whatever it is. Okay? So pick up on this next class, the spiritual quarrel, 1274 to 1318. All right, any questions we'll cover later. Okay? Thank you all, and God bless.